this section, this is our health and safety section, so we're going to have a look at what that means for us in security. In the private security industry, obviously we deal with a lot of things, and one of those things we have to deal with is the element of health and safety. Not just for us, not just for our employees or our employers, but also for our customers or anybody visiting our site. Every year, hundreds of people die in the workplace in accidents that could have been avoided if simple health and safety had been taken into account. More than that, many thousands have time off work ill as well. The main act under health and safety that we work under is the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974. This act covers pretty much everybody and anybody inside your premises at any given time. This includes anybody unlawfully on the site as well. So if somebody were to break into the property and fall down and injure themselves, technically they would be covered under health and safety. Now, that doesn't mean that if they injure themselves breaking in that they'd be covered, but let's say that you had an open trapdoor which was unmarked and they fell down and broke their leg, there is a good chance that they could put a claim in against you for that. Just like the ICO and the SIA, the HSE deal with everything relating to health and safety. So any breaches of health and safety, breaching of the Act, if we go back to what we discussed earlier on law, we would realize that a breach of health and safety is in fact a breach of an Act of Parliament, which means it is a criminal offence as opposed to a civil matter. Now, there can be a civil element to this because obviously if I break my leg, I could then sue a company that I worked for, but I could also end up in a situation where I am going to court in a situation where I've had my leg injured and it's a criminal conviction that they're going for against owners, managers, etc. because I was not correctly trained, I wasn't given any protective equipment, etc., etc. If that's found to be a fact, then the owners of the company can be held responsible for that and can end up with a criminal conviction against them. The maximum penalty for breach of health and safety can be up to 2 years imprisonment and an unlimited fine. All right, responsibilities of the employer. So your boss that you work for has a responsibility for the health and safety of all their employees, as well as anybody affected by that employee's acts and omissions. So if I was to, say, injure somebody, but then I could show that I was never fully trained in how to carry out, say, an ejection correctly, then that would fall on me, but it would also fall on the company vicariously, and they may be then taken to court over any injury sustained to that customer. So your employer has a duty of care. They have to provide you with safe equipment, training, safe access and egress to buildings. They have to make sure that you're trained in fire safety, make sure you're trained in evacuation. And all these things are very important because it doesn't just affect you, it affects your customers as well. Depending where you work, there may be a health and safety written policy and even a safety committee. Responsibility of the employee. Now, as an employee, you're also responsible for your own actions and your omissions as well. So things you do and things you don't do. It's very easy to just blame your boss for it, but in fact, if you have been trained on how to do something and then you choose not to do it correctly or not wear the corrective gear, you then can get yourself into trouble, either by getting yourself fired potentially, disciplined, or potentially, in more severe cases, getting yourself taken to court over breaches of health and safety. So your number one priority in anything is yourself. So ideally, you've got to take care of your own health and safety. So if somebody asks you to do something and you deem that thing to be unsafe, then you need to tell them, no, under health and safety, I cannot do this. Again, within reason, if you have been trained and you are equipped to do it, then obviously that's part of your job, then you would do it. But if, on the other hand, you've never been trained and you feel unsafe in doing something, then you have to raise an objection to doing it. Better would be to actually raise that objection in writing as well. So your job is to look after your own health and safety, use your training, attend all training, wear your personal protective equipment, and don't do anything unsafe. Okay, let's have a look at risk assessment. So risk assessment is where I have a look at a room, for example, and I look out for things called hazards. Now, if I look out for a hazard, what I'm looking for is something that has the potential to cause harm. So a hazard is anything that has the potential to cause harm. A risk is the percentage chance of that hazard causing harm. So, for example, if I have a chair blocking a fire exit, the chances of that causing harm in an emergency are very high. If the chair is tucked away in a corner, although it's still potentially a trip hazard, the risk of somebody falling over it is quite low. A staircase would always be classed as a hazard because there's the potential to cause harm. People could fall down and hurt themselves. A staircase can never be removed, but what we can do is reduce the risk of harm by making sure it is well lit, by making sure it has handrails, non-slip flooring, people aren't blocking it, etc., etc. So a risk assessment is identifying hazards, quantifying the risks, and taking measures to reduce the risks to an acceptable level. Good health and safety practice is all about reducing risk to an acceptable level. As I said, if we can reduce hazards, we do, but in certain cases we're not able to do so. In the case of the stairs, or even in the case of a lift, that is always going to be a hazard, but you don't have a way around that if you're working on the 10th story of a building. So 5 steps to a risk assessment is: number 1, identify hazards. Number 2, identify those who could be harmed. Number 3, take measures to reduce the risk of somebody being harmed. Number 4, record the findings. And number 5, review as necessary. So some of the typical things you might come across in everyday working environment, which would be seen as potential hazards, would be things like blocked fire exits, blocked staircases, bad lighting outside a venue, slippery floors, wet floors with no signage up, all of these kind of things in a venue where you're working where there's glass. It could potentially even be a broken glass on the floor which hasn't been collected. This is now a hazard because someone could step on that and injure themselves. Some of the things we control, especially working in say a licensed venue, a nightclub or pub or something like that, is we actually control the numbers coming in. Overcrowding is a serious risk and can be very dangerous involving too many people in a small space, can be very, very dangerous, and in fact can even cause fatalities in extreme circumstances. So we have to control the numbers coming in. Now, quite often we'll be guided as to how many people are allowed in a premises, especially if it's a licensed premises. It would be part of that venue's license as to how many people are allowed in. However, building regulations will always be the number one. Building regulations would state how many people could fit in any space inside the building. And that's calculated on how many exits there are and how long it would take people to safely exit that building in an emergency. Now, you may have heard the term PPE before. Well, PPE stands for personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment is anything that can be used to protect yourself or others from harm. So this could be anything from high visibility clothing, steel toe cap boots if you're working in an environment which requires you to protect your shoes, gloves for either searching or cold weather operations. This could also involve anything like headwear, helmets, eye protection, hearing protection, radios, mobile phones, torches. All of these things come under personal protective equipment. So just remember, PPE stands for personal protective equipment and is anything which helps protect you from either your environment, your surroundings, help light the environment around you, and just basically keep you safe. Other dangers you can come across are things like bodily fluid, blood, vomit, these kind of things. Again, working in certain environments, you might come across this more often than not. And of course, needles. If you're working in an environment where you have to do patrols and you come across something like a used needle, what you need to be very sure about is that you don't touch it ever with your hands. What you need to do is firstly be trained in how to handle that. And if you are trained, you would use normally a litter picker to pick it up so you make no physical contact. Remember also, disposing of such waste has to be followed very strict precautions. You have to follow strict precautions when disposing of such waste, such as you cannot take a needle and throw it in a dustbin. It has to go in a sharps box. Any needles or blades always have to go in a sharps box to protect anybody else involved, i.e. The refuse collection company comes in to take away the rubbish, and if there's a needle in the bag, there's a chance that the person picking up that bag can then get stabbed with a needle. Sharps boxes are generally a yellow in color. Yellow denotes a hazard, and obviously any needles or sharps inside that box then are very clearly visible as being hazards. Other dangers are things such as manual handling. Now, manual handling includes moving anything with any weight, including a person. So if you're not trained on how to move a person, you can end up causing yourself injury as well as potentially causing them injury. If you do a door supervision course, you'll be trained on how to escort people according to SIA protocols. If you are manhandling or moving any object, it is very important that you protect your back. Back injuries can be long-lasting, and you may need an awful lot of work to get back on your feet again. Safe lifting technique. So the most important thing with a safe lifting technique is to make sure that you're balanced, your feet are shoulder width apart, and you bend your knees and you keep your back as straight as you possibly can. If you bend your back, you're putting a lateral load on the spine, which can cause damage such as ruptured discs, herniated discs, etc. And if you get one of those, this can be an awful lot of surgery that you'll need to repair you. It can also be very, very long-lasting effects on you. So you've got to be careful when carrying anything heavy. And if you're uncomfortable, the first thing you want to ask is does it have to be moved at all? When looking at any load, do you have to manually move it, or can equipment be used? Is there an alternative to having to move this load yourself? Now looking at sort of a fairly favorite section as far as the exam is concerned, and that is the colors of the signs. So health and safety signage. It's important that you know these colors for your workplace. It's very important that you know what each sign means. So under health and safety, all signs are color-coded to give you a better idea of what they mean from potentially a little bit of a distance away. So a prohibition sign is a very common sign that you may see. And a prohibition sign means that you are prohibited from doing whatever the sign denotes. So in other words, if you see a cigarette with a red circle around it with a red line going through the middle, that would be denoting that you cannot smoke. So prohibition means you cannot. It is red with a white background and normally a picture inside showing what you can't do. The next sign that we look at is a warning sign. Now normally the warning signs are going to come in a triangle in shape, not always, but most generally they'll have a triangle on it somewhere. There will be yellow with black outline and black writing. Now this is a warning, and normally it'll tell you underneath what the warning is. It might be danger high voltage, it might be a dangerous shock, it might be danger of sharp objects, etc., etc. It could be one of many things, but as I said, it's a yellow sign, triangular in size, triangular in shape with black writing. The next sign that we'll look at is the mandatory sign. Mandatory sign means something you must comply with. So kind of the opposite of the prohibition sign. Prohibition meaning you can't, mandatory meaning you must. So for example, if you see a fire door, it will generally say fire door keep shut, and that is a must. You must comply with this sign. Then we have safe condition signs. These are green signs with white writing. Normally found on fire exits as well as your first aid kits. Then we've got fire equipment signs. These are normally red signs with white writing, and they're normally around your fire equipment. It could be anything from a fire blanket to your fire extinguishers. We also have hazardous chemical signs, normally found wherever hazardous chemicals are stored, so cleaning equipment. Also things like HGVs carrying chemicals with them. They'll normally have signage on the back, which will also have a telephone number, emergency telephone number, explaining to you which number to call if the truck, say, has an accident. Okay, so very basic bit of first aid here. We're just going to go through some very basic bits as far as first aid is concerned. So primarily what we need to remember is you're not going to be a doctor, and we're not training you to be a doctor. We're training you to give first aid as quickly as possible and as thoroughly as possible before the emergency services arrive. Okay, so our first thing we always want to remember is the number one priority is ourselves. So we want to make sure that we are safe. Okay, secondary to that, of course, is our casualty. So our casualty, what we're trying to do is we're trying to put them in a position where they can recover, where they don't deteriorate any further, and of course we can give basic life support if we need to. So the main aims of first aid are preservation of life, prevent deterioration, and promote a natural recovery. We're not allowed to give them any form of drugs at all. So in other words, I can't give them, even if somebody came up to me and said, I've got a headache, please can I have a painkiller, I'm not allowed legally to give that to them. I can put that down and see what happens if they take it themselves. However, I can never put something in their hand. Okay, so we've got to be very careful with that. What we can do is we can assist somebody by helping them with their own medication that they brought with them. We cannot start diagnosing people and start giving them medication from our point of view. Under health and safety law, all employers need to provide adequate training as well as facilities for first aid under the legislation. As mentioned before, our number one priority is checking that it's safe for us. So we work under a Dr. ABC, which is a little acronym we use, and the D stands for danger. So the first thing we want to do is check for danger to make sure that the area is safe for us to give first aid. Then we would ask for a response, see if the patient is responsive to us. Then we're going to go to airway, breathing, circulation. We'd also check for any fluids such as blood around the body, and of course any heavy bleeds, we would try and control that bleed as quickly as possible to prevent the patient going into shock. Now, if you are a first aider on site, you need to know what your responsibilities are. You need to know where your kit is, and it's your responsibility also, if you do use that kit, to make sure that any stock used up is replenished. You're also responsible for writing all reports subsequent to any first aid situation. So if I was to give first aid to somebody, my first priority is me, second priority is the patient, and then lastly is the follow-up after the incident is over. And this includes writing all reports, filling out your accident book, and passing on any information to any of the authorities that would require it. Under HSE regulations, all first aid kits needs to be airtight, it needs to be green with a white cross, and it needs to be adequately stocked and replenished if stocks are used. Remember also, calling 999 or 112 in an emergency promptly is very important. The sooner you call, the sooner help can get to them. Now, when you deal with a emergency operator, they will have a checklist which they will go through with you. Obviously, who you are, where you're calling from, and the nature of the emergency will be the first few items on that checklist that they'll go through with you. They will then continue to work through this checklist, making sure that the patient is making sure if the patient is breathing, are they conscious, what is the nature of the injury or illness, etc., etc. So they'll go through that with you. Your job is to stay calm and keep the patient calm if they are conscious as well, because that goes a long way to prevent shock. As mentioned already, post-incident, your job will be to fill out all relevant paperwork and all report writing as well. One of the areas you may need to report to is RIDDOR. RIDDOR is Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulations 2013. There are certain illnesses and injuries as well as close calls that need to be reported under RIDDOR regulations. You can go to RIDDOR online and you can have a look at what would need to be reported. But essentially it's serious injuries that require hospitalization, extended time off work, and things of that nature. Close calls are actually also required to be reported. So if we had scaffolding collapse and it fell down but no one was injured, it would still be reportable under RIDDOR. The employer must also report any serious accidents and injuries in the workplace to the local authority as well as the HSE and potentially RIDDOR.